So we have people joining this afternoon's webinar. Welcome as folks come into the Zoom. We're really happy to have you here for this final webinar has been offered by the California Demographic Data Collaborative, comprised of the James Irvine Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and California Endowment. To really center and strengthen nonprofits and the organizations these foundations support, and strengthen their capacity to collect, use, and engage demographic data. So as folks come into the room, we just want to remind you that, again, this is the last of a series of 5 webinars. It will be an open conversation for the most part, and really an opportunity for people who have attended prior webinars or for whom this is the first, to just put some questions on the table and to engage directly with representatives from the foundations of the collaborative, and to put your questions out there for them to engage, and also to hear a little bit from them about sort of what was the motivation and what did they learn from their process of working together, from their process of engaging nonprofits around this data, and some thoughts about what they have in terms of going forward. So my name is Kelly Brown. I am the principal and CEO at Viewpoint Consulting, and I'm joined today by my colleagues from the 3 foundations. We have this afternoon Kelly Martin from the James Irvine Foundation, joined with her colleague Kim Canfield, also from the James Irvine Foundation. Han Kao Yu from the California Endowment, and she's representing the endowment, but we have also been on this journey with Elizabeth Tabita from the California Endowment, and Patricia Avila Garcia from the California Endowment as well. They've also been critical parts of the team. We also have Joyce Ibarra from the Weingart Foundation, and her partner, Angela Carr, has been an important colleague along this way. But today we have the 4 you see in front of you, and we'll be in just conversation with everyone about what we've learned along the way. Also, I should say, joined by my colleague, Megan McVetti, who has been our stalwart and a behind-the-scenes person, and who will be helping to manage the conversation in the chat. So just a quick recap of the first sessions that we have offered in this webinar. We started with the why demographic data is so critical. We then moved on to sort of the tools and taxonomies. It's like the what to collect and how to make that relevant, inclusive, and approachable. A third session was on data collection strategies, how to get this data, how to get it effectively, appropriately, respectfully. And the last session a couple of weeks ago was on how to use the data once you have it, and once you you want to try and engage it. As we sent out last week to everyone who had both registered and attended prior sessions, all of the webinars, the decks to the webinars, and supplemental materials from those first 4 sessions are now available on a YouTube channel, and available to access for anyone with that link. So we encourage you to go back and revisit those, and listen to them, and obviously follow up with any questions if you have them. We tried to make the supplemental material supportive of what we covered in the webinars, but to also keep it manageable. So again, as I mentioned, today we are going to just be in conversation with the collaborative partners. We have some questions queued up for them about what they've learned, how they're going to use this data, building some momentum and sort of grounding it in a larger field. But this is really a session for all of you to ask your questions. So we really want to encourage you not to be shy and not to be quiet, to jump in with your own questions and with your own comments and concerns and thoughts and ideas and things that you really want to share with each other, because we think this is a space where there's already a lot of learning and a lot of expertise out there that we're wanting to build on, and we wanted to provide this opportunity for you to share it. So before we jump in, I'm wondering if folks can just in the chat just put whether or not you have been, if you've attended a prior webinars, like more than 2 or 3, just to give us some sense of how, the grounding around the folks in the room, what you've been exposed to so far. So if you can just put in the chat, yes, I've attended 2, I've attended 3, this is my first one. That would be helpful as we transition to the conversation. Oops. So as that happens, we've outlined the agenda, but now I'm going to take us off share so that we can really be in discussion with each other. And just want to start the conversation while people get their questions going. I just want to hear from all of you, from each of you, as much as you're willing to share. Like, we've been on this journey, for a couple of years. The collaborative started as a way to streamline the data requests that your foundation's made of organizations, and that's how we started working together. But would love to hear from anyone, and if you can start, Joyce, Kelly, kind of what have you learned? Like, what are the 1 or 2 big takeaways that you've gotten from this process?
I'm happy to jump in. The process, as you all know, began, I don't know, 2.5, almost 3 years ago with this group. And we knew we wanted to center nonprofit voice in our process and anything that we came up with. And a lot of the lessons came from the very beginning with the survey we did and the focus groups that we engaged in to understand who's already engaging with data in this way, demographic data. And one of the most surprising, or maybe not surprising, things was that many of you already do report this type of data, but it was the number of entities that you report to, over 75 or 80 or 90, I believe. That was really quite shocking, which kind of reinforced then why it was important for us as 3 private foundations that share alignment around equity and racial equity to help ease that burden a little bit. But it was also very hopeful for me to hear that you're already, a lot of folks, a lot of our nonprofit partners are already collecting the data, which means, they're using it, either because funders are requiring it or hopefully for their own purposes. What was also very helpful to hear from the partners was the need for capacity around it. I suspect that, of the 90 some entities that folks report to, many of them were government. But I suspect maybe smaller organizations that don't even receive government funding are the ones that might need more help in figuring out how to collect this type of data, both from their constituents and the folks who work with them and their boards, which is all of the data that we're, the 3 of our foundations are interested in collecting and looking at. And the third thing that I think that I took away from the survey and focus groups was that nonprofits wanted that data back from us. If we were to figure out a way to collect the data, how can we make it accessible back? And so I think there is work for us to do around that and building that field capacity as, from the point of where we sit as private foundations, and how do we collaborate, create the infrastructure, create the access for nonprofits then to use data that they are contributing to, so that it is more of a 2-way street and a conversation around what it means, both from us, from our perspective, as well as from the nonprofits, and how they could utilize that data in their communities to advance their missions and their work. I'll stop there so my other colleagues can jump in with their thoughts too.
I echo what Joyce already said. I think you'll hear a lot of kind of overlap from the 3 of us. There is a lot of synergy, I think, in the way that we think about this. So I won't repeat. I will add, I think a few things that came up for me is really with Kelly's expertise of learning about how complex it actually is to collect the data. It's not simple, and we need to be aware of that. I also think that we did a lot of learning of we need to be better about how we are collecting data ourselves of our staff, and kind of going through that process ourselves has been really enlightening. definitely learned about the redundancy in the field, and just very much echo Joyce's comments about how it's kind of incumbent on us to work together to kind of reduce that redundancy. And I guess the last thing I would say is that you don't know what you don't know. And so that's been very helpful to really kind of keep that in mind as we're going forward in this process.
Okay, and I'll jump in. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all, especially those of you who are repeat returners. I know you are like the real fans, so good to see that some of you've have been to at least up to 3 webinars to date. And I really want to thank our funding collaborators in Irvine and Weingart, as well as Kelly and their team, because we at the California Endowment has been at this for quite a long time. I actually, before I came to the California Endowment, I had worked with the Kellogg Foundation and done quite a bit of work around DEI organizational audits of both the Kellogg and the California Endowment. And we really recommended a couple of decades ago thinking around a more consistent, streamlined approach to collecting demographic data, and not forgetting why we're asking for this information. And I know the webinars really emphasize that in terms of thinking about equitable distribution to communities that historically have not been well funded by philanthropy. And so we don't know that how well we're doing unless we have the data to benchmark that whole process. So just to echo what Joyce and Kelly have been saying, that we didn't want to make any assumptions. Certainly funders are very interested in doing this kind of data collection work in a consistent way, and yet doing it all on our own. So we came in with a strong interest about what would it take for us to develop something that's much more consistent and streamlined to minimize the burden on our grantee partners. That was really important to us. So we were beginning to get really key insights in terms of your feedback as our grantee partners. And Kelly has shared that, there were 3 problems around lack of resources and capacity that we need to be thinking as funders, how we support this kind of building out. So a lot of it to me is actually less political will and more infrastructure type issues, whether it's a consistent taxonomy or lack of resources and capacity in-house, and then lack of quality, just in terms of being able to use that, the data, high quality data, to understand the impacts on our ultimate, those that we serve. So I thought that was all really important. And then thinking about how to bridge that beyond these 3 foundations, so I think I'm kind of extending out a little bit more into some of the future work, but certainly if we want to really practice trust-based philanthropy, we need to go beyond these 3 foundations and continue to engage our colleagues on how do we streamline this. Because the other thing that was really striking to me is how much even amongst 3 foundations we have overlap and grantee partners. So again, there are so many opportunities for greater collaboration and speaking with each other and coordinate in a big way. In fact, we were saying how much we enjoyed doing this work with each other and with Kelly, that we'll have to wean ourselves off of Kelly and her team in order to continue to streamline these efforts around data requests and crunching of the data.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And I think one of the, as we discussed going along was, I think, your point as you started, Joyce, was that the awareness, I think there was a lot of assumptions among many foundations that this was something that nonprofits was new to nonprofits and they weren't used to. And we found that actually was not the case, that the burden was not asking the question, the burden was asking it in lots of different ways and not giving people the support to, to collect it and use it appropriately. And I think one thing that, that I've also learned from, from going through this process is how, how there are a lot of resources, I think, from the larger field outside of the social sector to understand how to ask these questions appropriately of individuals, how to collect the data, how to use it, that even for individuals, these questions are not new or scary or weird, that people are used to asking these questions. A lot of it is just sort of, getting a better understanding of how to do it, do it appropriately. And then understanding sort of where is the capacity? Is the capacity, because what we've heard is like it's sometimes among small organizations, it's easy because there are only a handful of folks, but in larger organizations have, you know, infrastructure and HR departments or what have you. It's really sometimes in the middle ground that we really need to understand the capacity building. But I'm curious about kind of just a little bit more in terms of the collaborative effort. I mean, I think that is you know, what did you sort of learn from working with each other? I mean, obviously you're three different foundations. As we reiterated all along the way, is that, you know, there's a shared commitment to justice and equity, but you're different kinds of foundations. Your thrusts are different, your approaches are different, your scopes are different. Sort of what did you, if anything, did you kind of learn from that collaborative process? Or was there anything kind of internal to your own foundations that either shifted or informed, you know, how you worked together?
I can kick off again. We're like the smallest of the three foundations. So for us, it was important to collaborate in this way to contribute more meaningfully to the field. But at the same time, because we're the smallest, I think we're the most nimble. So what I learned is I have to slow down, or we had to slow down a little bit to make progress. But we saw that it would benefit, you know, our nonprofit partners because we share, like as we mentioned, we share a lot of grantees amongst the three of us. So that was part of it. And then I just lost my train of thought. So if someone else wants to jump in while I try to refine it, go ahead, Kim.
No, I'm thinking of that. What is that line about you meet one foundation and you meet one foundation, right? And how we all think we're special, dainty flowers and nothing alike any other foundation. But I think the reality is the three of us can come together and agree on taxonomy, agree on approach. It's just a really good example that all foundations could really get together and probably agree on a lot of things and how to implement a project like this. So it can be done.
I would just add, I think the saying perfection is the enemy of progress. And I feel like we have kind of taken that to heart in the positive that, you know, if we really want to make progress, we need to compromise and be able to, in order to be able to move forward and to make progress. And I want to be more like Joyce and be nimble and be able to move more quickly.
Yeah, I would say the same, Joyce, just in the sense that we're the largest of the three partners, and I feel the drag sometimes because we can't move as quickly. For example, we wanted to get out key communications to you all, and yet we got to make sure that we're streamlining our communications. So we're not over inundating our grantee partners with too many mailings, so that we have to coordinate all of that, or we want to do language translation of key messaging. So those are the things that we've set up for with good intentions, but it definitely slows us down. I would say the other thing which I really value is that I come from the learning and evaluation perspective from my foundation. And it's great to have grants administration folks at the table, and within even the larger national collaborative, it's good to have IT as well as legal perspectives, because there's so many different ways that we can cut the shaping of what the issues that we're trying to define and what's stopping us from moving forward. So I think that part's really important. The other piece is just exchanging what we're doing. We've actually instituted a lot of different practices through this throughout this collaboration. For example, when the racial reckoning happened in the 2020s and the pandemic hit, we just decided when we established a Black Power Fund, as well as funding API groups to fight the API hate, as well as a Native Fund, that we didn't have adequate data to really understand this. So we forged forward as an exec team and said we need to make this data collection and requirements, because our response rate had plummeted and we're trying to figure out why. And it's just not adequate to report on 20-30% response rate. We want it to be as holistic and complete as possible. So that is one example of saying that legally we can require that and just have a decline to state option in each of the questions, you know, as we go through this. And you started asking about what did we implement through this, or what did we bring back? So I wanted to say we made a lot of updates to our grants management system. Our GEO team, our grants operation team, was a part of this regular conversation. So we ended up clarifying our definition of what we meant by BIPOC-led. For example, we updated our letter to our partners on why we're asking for this data in a more concise way. We integrated GuideStar with our GMS grants management system, so that we can really have the two systems speak to each other, and then be able to bring in what we're talking about. How do we bring in the data so that our grantee partners can see what data they've already submitted and needs to be updated, rather than having to go back and forth too many times. We also, in a larger scheme of things, wanted to make sure we commit to a field level administrative repository, as Kelly has talked about, to collect all kinds of data that's commonly asked across foundations. So in addition to demographic data, we're asking for things like most recent 990 filings, the current board of directors list, expenses and revenues, mission statement, and demographic data, so that you don't have to submit that over and over and over again, that there's this one place to do all of that. So those are just some examples of practices that I'm really excited about, because, you know, if we all join in, then we see the return instantly in our grantee partners' time, as well as the amount of follow-up we have to do to make sure we get all of that in order to get a grant agreement in place and a grant approval.
Great, and we can talk a little bit more about what's sort of building, but I want to pause and see if are there any questions, Megan, in the chat or the Q&A that we should?
Yeah, we have one that is related to getting an example of a disability or ability question. And that's something that's been touched upon before. And as I know you'll note, we are sharing resources, and we'll post links in the chat toward the end of this hour, but there's certainly many examples that can be shared.
Yeah, and we will say that there has recently been some work, and Joyce, I don't know if you are closer to this, but there had been a roundtable, I understand, of foundations that had been focusing specifically on sort of bringing the disability community more into the conversation, and did a lot of work on what were appropriate questions, how to answer them, and thinking about, again, a lot of the work that we did when we were looking at the taxonomy was what are questions that are appropriate for individuals, and what are the kinds of questions that are appropriate for collecting aggregate data on disabilities. So to answer that, we can absolutely share some of that research that went on from, that was commissioned by the Constellation of Foundations. But Joyce, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the Forum on Disability Inclusion. I think that's what they're now calling themselves. And it's a membership organization of philanthropic entities that have an interest in funding in this space. And as with a lot of different data, there's just a dearth of information on what grant dollars actually go to nonprofits that fund communities that are disabled. And so they do have, I think there's different definitions in terms of even looking at disability inclusion versus disability justice. And I think, there is movement towards wanting to understand how nonprofits even define that. And a lot of it is the, what is considered a disability, and there's standard taxonomies around different health conditions, but there are other ways of looking at it as well. And so there's challenges, and there's movement towards being more inclusive on how we even collect that data. So there's certainly resources that will include, and I'm trying to look at the question in the chat in terms of how we would use that information, and if for us, it's in the aggregate, and it's really trying to understand what percentage of our grantees are focused on this community. And in particular, too, along with the other demographic data that we collect, what are the intersections? And that's a piece that we haven't really touched upon, is really the intersectionality among the different types of information that we collect, demographic information, which really is informative in terms of, especially when talking about racial justice and in identifying where there are opportunities and where we can deepen our investments.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And again, we'll just reiterate, we'll share those resources and along with this webinar. But I think that this also sort of relates to, a deeper question I have for each of you around sort of using the data. And so like now you have it, what are you going to do with it? But I think a lot of times, and we've said this many times, is that it's beyond the numbers. It's not just checkboxing, it's insight. And for those of you who listened to the last webinar when we had Ali from Kalamazoo, and she mentioned the the example where even in working with organizations that were people of color led or Black led in some cases, that engaging this range of parameters around identity helped them strengthen their own work. And, when you're thinking about ability and access, I mean, that affects everyone. The range of people who are affected by a range of different kinds of abilities is across the board, across all kinds of different abilities, and understanding whether your services, your programs, your buildings, whatever are accessible is part of the conversation. So it's much more than just how many people in a wheelchair do you have. It's really are our organizations, whatever the issue, whatever the location, really being inclusive and accessible. Did folks have other additions? Anything y'all wanted to add about, kind of how you're going to make use of this? And again, to remind folks is that all of you had been collecting this data in some way, even before this effort. That was actually part of the motivation. It was like, we're all collecting in different kinds of ways. So maybe, folks are interested in sort of thinking about how will this, how will this inform and strengthen the insight that you have for your work?
Well, I could just answer the kind of question of, and double click on what Joyce said earlier of, how will we use this data? And I just want to reiterate that Irvine uses the data in aggregate, and that is how we have always looked at the data, that we're not interested in looking at an organization individually. We're looking at our grantee population collectively and say, what does our grantee population look like? We have a North Star where we have a vision of where low-income workers in California have the power to advance economically. And we want to make sure that we are serving those populations. So I think that's really kind of a drive for why we want to collect this data.
Other strategic uses, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say the same. We're very much more explicit now about how we're addressing racial equity within our mission and strategic plan. And one of the key focal point is definitely thinking about how we're addressing anti-Black racism and Indigenous erasure. So our staff has said that we'd like to make sure we build the capacity of Black-led and Native-led organizations. And so again, we won't know until we get the information in terms of who we're funding in the aggregate and how we're addressing capacity needs or strengths that are in our grantee pool. So again, I think it's definitely in the aggregate. We are very clear we don't use it for individual funding decisions. We have that in the letter. We use it for internal accountability purposes, like what I just described, as well as aggregated external reporting. We share that kind of data with what was formerly the Foundation Center and now Candid. By the way, have you talked about, Kelly, the relationship between GuideStar and Candid? Because I know even our staff has some confusion about who are these two entities and are they one and the same?
Yeah, well, that's a good segue to sort of to sort of give some people some grounding. And I think along the way, we have sort of referred to Candid with them, with not a whole lot of depth about what they are. But for those who don't know, there was a entity called the Foundation Center, which was largely an entity for decades. I'm not sure how old they are, but at least 30, 40 years old, I would think. That was a repository of information on funding, on grants, like information on where grant foundation dollars dollars were going. And GuideStar was a sort of a data aggregator that drew data largely from 990s on nonprofits to give the field a better understanding of the nonprofit sector based on 990s. And I think about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, those two merged into Candid. And so now Candid is an entity that's actually trying to merge those data sets of where philanthropic dollars are going with the entities and the organizations that are on the receiving end across the board, not just the receiving end of foundation dollars, but nonprofits in general. So that includes individual donors and government agencies and what have you. So we have been working, Viewpoint has been working, but also all of your foundations have been working with that new entity, Candid, as it starts to merge and integrate those data sets to really provide the whole social sector with a more integrated, streamlined picture of the social sector. And this is also why where this effort is really trying to contribute to building systems that streamline the data collection process for nonprofits, not only so that they can, reduce the amount of requests they have to reply to in terms of their reporting, but also can get data back on their own sectors, on their own work, on their own peers, that it's really a two-way street. But, as for those of you who are familiar with data, which I am not, that's more than a notion. That's a big endeavor. And so the process of streamlining that is considerable, but we've been doing a lot of work with that. So that's, Foundation Center was the foundation grant making, GuideStar was the nonprofit data, and Candid is the integration of those things.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for clarifying that. You are such an expert in what's happening around all the data systems, so it's helpful to provide that context. I'll add just a couple more things. One is, having worked with a national group of funders of 15 plus, I know that foundations are very interested in aligning around this. Again, it's the how to do it. Do we do it ourselves? Do we do it with something larger? So asking those kinds of, do we have a common definition of what we mean by BIPOC led or people of color led? Is there a centralized data hub that can be used? Do we have best practices around the usage of the data? What do we benchmark that against? So there are a lot of those kinds of questions that are out there. Certainly, we did try to kind of think about it in terms of the most common case. Certainly issues around fiscally sponsored projects. Who do you collect data from? And what if you fund globally? What does BIPOC-led even mean in a global context? So we took out some of those and said, what do 95% of the data, pertain to, and start there, and then expand to get at some of the more knotty problems that are out there. Yeah. The other thing is, even in the short amount of time, I'm going to give a lot of kudos to Candid for really stepping up to provide that nationwide infrastructure, because a number of our grantees transcend California borders, and being able to talk about this across geography is really important, because we know many of our grantee partners in California get funding from funders outside of California. So we're not thinking small. We got to make sure we align by region, by state, and nationally in order to make sure that we have a system where there's a very ambitious target by Candid to say by 2030 to get at least 80% or more of nonprofits to get all of the data into GuideStar. So this is just something that's going to be so important to everybody, not just private funders, but also public funders. Yeah. So it's kind of in the cards, and I think everyone is interested, whether they're nonprofits or foundations, that we're all kind of really beginning after many decades of effort to align around doing this in a way that is going to make it easiest and not reinvent the wheel every single organization at a time.
Easiest and useful. So Megan, do we have some questions in the queue from folks? You want to make sure?
We do. We have a couple. Victoria says, curious if anyone has ideas of how demographic data can be shared back to the people or communities that we are collecting from, in addition to sharing with partners and funders. So any ideas?
It would be interesting to hear, if you just have brainstorm ideas, where we're not making you commit to anything, that would be good to hear. But I do feel like this has been a very consistent question that we have raised in our work with Candid and other data aggregators is how to make the request for data that we're making from nonprofits useful to them. And when we did the engagement with nonprofits in California with the focus groups in the survey, that was a real yearning. It's like, how can we use this data? We already collected for our own purposes, but how can we even deepen and expand our capacity to engage not only this data that we're collecting through an entity like Candid, but even, government data sources, other data sources that we're being asked to communicate with. So that, how to do that is definitely on the table. Sort of what is the access that people will need, what will be the format, what is the level of detail, folks. So we are really in active conversation with at least Candid and with others around how to make this kind of a virtuous cycle. But we will say is that this is an opportunity, and I meant to say this earlier in the webinar, was that we really want, even beyond this webinar, your input and ideas, but we would love to hear from folks. How could this data be useful? What would be the format? What would people, be willing to provide? How, just ideas on how to make this more meaningful and accessible would be super helpful. But the short answer to your question is we're really trying to figure that out, how to make it available.
Yeah, and I'll just say, because we're at the foundation level, we really prioritize transparency. So any diverse, equity, and inclusion audits that we have conducted, or any sort of aggregation analysis of demographic data, we post that on our website. And I think, again, I just want to emphasize that's a starting point for conversations. So that one, you make that available, and then when we do feedback loops, whether it's CP, Center for Effective Philanthropy survey, grantee surveys, or more in-depth stakeholder engagement processes, those are the opportunities to really kind of bring back some of that, to say, how is this, how does this enhance our understanding of who we serve and who we're purportedly trying to help. And so I think that would be a good way. But the other thing is, I remember when I was actually a grantee applicant, I remember one being very consistent about when I collect the data is January of every year. And at TC, we're also consistent about trying to aim, say, October of every year, to the extent that we have good full set of data, we make that available on our website. So I think having some regularity so people can expect when the data will be shared is a good starting point for accessibility and transparency's sake.
But also just to piggyback on, I think what Kelly's last point was, I think for us at the Weingart Foundation, we would ask our nonprofit partners what would be helpful of the data that we have. Of course, providing it aggregate without, identifiers. Particularly, we're a regional funder, and we're increasingly funding cohorts or ecosystems of nonprofits that work together, and maybe they don't have access to who are our partners. We know you fund, X, Y, and Z. All of us are doing this in, X, Y, and Z community. What information do you have about who is represented at our table? I could see that this is now the brainstorm part of what you asked, Kelly, and maybe us providing that as we, as a funder, continue to see our role as evolving and being more in relationship with our grantees and less transactional. This is leaning into trust-based philanthropy and really trying to establish different type of relationship with our grantees, both individually but also collectively as they work together. And if we are invited to tables, and if that's a role we can play, we can certainly explore that. But I think it is something we need to learn about, but we would never take the lead on, and I would instead ask all of you, how can we be helpful in this way?
Actually, I'm wondering if anyone amongst all of our participants have thoughts in response to Victoria's question. I wonder if people can unmute themselves to chime in.
I don't think
talk, Kelly.
They can unmute, but they can put in the chat. But people can feel free to put it in the chat. But is there another question that we want to get on the table?
There is, and this goes to the original motivation of the collaborative foundations. In an effort to reduce the labor of grantee partners to complete our demographic survey, would it be in the interest of our collective foundations to do a joint demographics survey? And that also leads into how the partnership with Candid has unfolded. Part 2 of that question, will there be opportunities for other foundations to be involved in this effort?
So anyone want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the short answer is I think we are all looking to Candid to be kind of the collective way that this information is gathered. The 3 of our foundations are going to be using the demographics information from Candid of our grantees. So I think the more that the foundation community and the funding community can get on board with using what exists, which is the demographics via Candid, then that will reduce the burden of our grantees. And that's the intent of, like that was the original intent of this collaborative. I had a second thought. So I mean, in terms of how can other foundations get involved, I think that's with Candid, and really kind of, I think it would be an amazing kind of once in a lifetime moment if really there was this kind of groundswell of foundations that said, I'm no longer going to ask for this information individually, and I'm going to instead use Candid to gather this information.
But I will jump in and share. Sorry, Kim, did you want to?
I was just going to add a brief thing also, that to be an example for your grantees, if there are funders on this call, like we all have, to make sure that your own profiles are filled out and updated, because we can't be asking our grantees to do one thing and then we're not doing the same. So that was it.
But I think part of the question was, would it make sense to survey our grantees together? And we did explore that option. Like this is why it took so long. As a collaborative, we explored a lot of different options, Candid being one, but not, necessarily the default. But, there were concerns around who then owns the data and holds it, because we do know there are concerns about maybe from the nonprofit perspective on putting your data publicly on a platform like GuideStar, like Candid. So we did do the work to explore alternative options to Candid, and yet we still landed where we did now, which is this, joint push and campaign to at least commit to aligning and collecting this data in this way, with the hopes that it'll ease the burden for the slice of grantees that we share.
And I believe that demographic information will be available through a free API, correct, from Candid? So folks that are able to pull it into their system.
At this point, right,
Yeah.
right. The API into the grants management systems of foundations. Now, we don't want to speak too much on Candid's business model, but basically what we have learned over the past couple of years by doing this is that Candid is partnering to streamline the technology, so that makes it easier, because while, to Joyce's point, these three foundations could have come together. We discussed that, come together to do a joint survey. We worked on the taxonomy, but then what about all the dozens of other foundations that those same nonprofits are reporting to? The data still stays, within the confines, and that was the challenge that we were confronting and trying to overcome. When we got that information about how many entities that nonprofits were reporting this data to, we were like, there's got to be a bigger, better solution, and that does sort of transition, I think, to what keeps coming up. And again, what we want to reiterate from the folks who are on the call is like, now is the time to share with us not just your experience with Candid, your awareness of Candid, your problems of Candid, because that we are really going to go deep on whether or not that is viable for nonprofits in the long run, is because foundations seem to be, sort of garnering because Candid is making it easy to meet some needs, but we're really trying to lean into whether or not this is a viable mechanism for nonprofits to engage and to share their data, and to the earlier point, get data out and get useful data. So I think that is where that's where we're headed, and I think that's a question. I'll take one more question if there's one in the Is there another question in the chat? Or are we just seeing comments, Megan?
There is another question, just as we have a few minutes left. That prior question before we jump in leads to the push that the collaborative partners are going to be doing to encourage folks to share data. So just want to be sure you have a chance to address that before we take another question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll definitely wrap up with that one because that's the direction we're going.
Okay.
But that's the last question.
For data shared with nonprofits, it would be helpful to know the trends of giving for the last 5 years for BIPOC-led organizations. So in light of the 2020 major shifts in response to demands from nonprofits and communities, what is the trend pre-20 to 23? How are foundations supporting the sustainability of BIPOC-led organizations?
Yep. We know that there are a number of folks who are trying to get exactly that trend data. And again, part of this effort around aligning and streamlining and coalescing fuels the capacity to answer those questions, because right now the data is so fragmented, we can't really meaningfully data as hard as very, very, very smart people in the field are trying and doing. This is an effort that will inform the ability to actually answer those questions, not just today, but tomorrow and going forward for a range of things. But I'm curious if any of you have to want to respond to, even just for your own purposes and your own foundations, how are you thinking about those trends?
I mean, it's certainly why we're here, because we did not systematically collect that information in a way that would allow us to have a baseline from pre-2020 to now. And it was Ali, our guest on the last webinar, who talked about, really, it's about our own accountability to ourselves, who did make a commitment to racial justice and who did make a commitment to increase funding to BIPOC-led organizations. And so though we missed the boat on having that baseline information for ourselves, we have, as Kelly mentioned, fragmented data. We pulled whatever data we could that already existed in a platform like GuideStar, and we used to ask the question in a way that was very qualitative, which is still part of the conversation with our grantees, but there wasn't a way to really extract it, even for ourselves in terms of establishing the baseline and how we made movement. I think we could speak to it, but it's nice to also have the actual data to share back. And so that's what we're hoping this engagement will help us do, to your point, Kelly, from now and beyond, understanding that our commitment to racial justice is enduring.
Yep. I know TCE has been doing this for some time, tracking the data, but it's still less than perfect, right? In terms of how you're able to really assess. Yeah. I think that that those are the actual kinds of questions that this data leads to. Again, not just thresholds and percentages, but really understanding how a community is changing, where are resources going, how are foundations being effective at addressing what is emerging in communities. I just saw something in the chat about the recent AAPI report on Asian communities, and we learned that so much from the research, particularly in California, was how critical it is to understand the complexity and the nuance of those communities. And we know that what's happening in California is going to be happening nationwide. And how can we lay a foundation to understand the importance of getting that level of granularity over time? And so I think this is where this whole effort is pushing, is how do we build a better data infrastructure and ecosystem for the social sector in a way that is manageable, feasible, effective, insightful, that doesn't burden folks, but that actually provides the kind of insight and answers all of the different kinds of questions that folks are raising. What's trends? What communities are emerging? What, how are things changing? Where who's being left out? Who's missing? And that is why we're really pushing for people to explore the information that Ham put in the chat around the demographics via Candid, for people to explore that and whether or not that's viable, because these foundations will be, these three collaborative foundations will in the coming weeks be going back to the organizations that they fund to request to ask organizations to continue to fill out and strengthen their profiles via Candid, so that we can really start to lay that, that groundwork and build that baseline of data that the field as a whole can engage. So we encourage folks to be on the watch for those requests, and to also surface any challenges or issues that people have with it, because we're really trying to work out the kinks in that. So conscious of our time and our commitment to our 50-minute endeavor, we want to see if there are any final comments that folks want to make. We also want to say the webinars, including this one, will be available at the playlist, where we'll add a few more resources from this webinar to that link. We'll send it out to everybody who registered, and we don't want to limit you in any way to reaching out or giving feedback. You can get in touch with anyone individually with your questions or comments or what have you, but just want to turn it back over to folks to see if there's any closing comments.
Really can't thank Kelly Brown enough for her work, and her team, and Megan and Audris, who's not here, but just can't thank Kelly enough for her just steadfast leadership, support, and just really helping us kind of navigate through this, centering on our grantees and the nonprofit organizations that we want to serve throughout these past few years. We are here today at this point in time because of her, and it's just been an excellent journey. And I think our nonprofit partners are better served because of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say we never go wrong centering their perspective, experience, and ideas from our grantee partners. So just want to really thank you all for being there. We can't do it without you, and I think we have to work on this together and our joint commitment to equity. So I think that's huge for us.
Yep, just ditto the appreciation for all the colleagues on the screen, and all of you off the screen for hanging in there for a series of 5 webinars, I believe. And know that this is a work in progress. We don't have a perfect solution. So we appreciate any feedback and participation from all of you, so that we can continue to move forward and get better. Thank you.
Yes. And thanks to everyone. Stay tuned, reach out with questions, watch the playlist for additional information. And we're going to wrestle this to the ground, as I say. We are going to fix this. We're going to solve this problem. Thanks to everyone. And as I said, stay tuned.
Thank you.